The day Colonel Hartley laughed at my name, I was standing at attention in front of 47 male officers at Fort Bragg, and I had not slept in 31 hours. I remember the exact number because I had been counting. You do that when you're the only woman in a room. You count everything: hours of sleep, steps to the door, number of times someone calls you sweetheart versus your actual rank. You keep a tally in your head like it's evidence you're collecting for a trial that may never happen. My name is Sergeant First Class Zoe Merritt. That day, I was 28 years old, 8 years into my Army career, and I had just transferred from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, to a joint task force that nobody in that room seemed to think I belonged in. Colonel Hartley was the kind of man who had been handsome once and never gotten over it. He stood at the front of that briefing room with his arms crossed and a smile that hadn't reached his eyes in probably a decade. When Major Chen introduced me, "This is Sergeant First Class Merritt. She'll be leading night insertion coordination for the task force." Colonel Hartley looked at me the way you look at a car with a flat tire. "Like a problem you didn't ask for," he said. "What's your cause sign, honey?" "Not Sergeant. Not Merritt, honey." The room didn't exactly laugh. It was quieter than that, and worse. It was the sound of men deciding not to correct him. A few smiles. Someone coughed. I kept my eyes straight ahead. I had practiced for this, not this specific moment, but for a version of this moment, because I had known it was coming. I said, "Ghost 6, sir." He raised an eyebrow. "Ghost 6. He repeated it like it was a punchline. Cute. Turned back to the map on the wall. Done with me? Or so he thought. I didn't react. I didn't let myself. But something locked in my chest that morning, something quiet and cold and patient, and I knew, the way you know certain things before you can explain them, that this wasn't over, that I would stand in a room with Colonel Hartley again one day, and it would be different. I just didn't know yet how different. I grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, which means I grew up in the shadow of Fort Campbell. My dad was Army. His dad was Army. There's a picture on my parents' kitchen wall. It's been there since before I was born, of my grandfather in his dress uniform, standing ramrod straight, hat in hand. Underneath it, my grandmother wrote in marker on the back of a recipe card and taped it to the frame, "Service is not a burden. It is a privilege." I believe that. Still do, actually, even after everything. My mother thought I would outgrow it. She had her reasons. When I was 12, my dad deployed to Iraq for the second time, and she had to work 2 jobs and raise me and my younger brother alone for 14 months. She knew what service cost up close, not in the abstract. She wanted something softer for me. But I enlisted at 18. My dad drove me to the recruiter's office and didn't say a word the whole way there. When we got to the parking lot, he turned off the engine and sat for a second, and then he said, "You don't have to do this." I said, "I know." He nodded, got out of the car, held the door open for me. That was the most he ever said about it. I flew through basic, did well in AIT, applied for flight school on a dare from my bunkmate, a tall woman from Phoenix named, well, she went by Tank, which was the only name that mattered. Tank told me I was wasting myself doing supply runs when I could be flying, and I told her she was out of her mind, and then I applied anyway because she wasn't wrong. I graduated from the Army aviation program, and eventually, after years of work I won't pretend was easy, I earned a slot with the 160th, the Night Stalkers. The unit that flies special operations forces into places that don't officially exist at night in conditions that would ground most aircraft. By the time I was transferred to that joint task force, I had over 2,000 flight hours. I had flown combat missions in 3 countries. I had been shot at enough times that I had lost count, which I think is its own kind of answer to certain questions. None of that was in the room when Colonel Hartley called me honey. The task force was based out of a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, and the work was precise and grinding and relentless. We were coordinating night insertions for a series of raids that the Army wasn't officially conforming to anyone, which meant the paperwork was a nightmare and the communication between units was worse. I was good at my job. I want to say that plainly, not because I need you to like me, but because what happened later makes no sense unless you understand that first. I was good. I was organized and calm under pressure, and I had a technical knowledge of the airspace in that region that very few people at that FOB could match. My immediate superior was Captain Donovan, who was fair and overworked and basically left me alone to do what I did, which was exactly what I wanted. Below me, I had two warrant officers, a quiet guy from Alabama we all called Stitch, and a woman from New Jersey named Sergeant Walsh, who was the sharpest mind in our section and knew it. And then there was Lieutenant Bryce Calloway. Bryce was Colonel Hartley's protege. Had been since Hartley spotted him at some leadership evaluation 2 years earlier and decided he was the future of the Army. Bryce was 24, 6'1", jaw like a movie poster. He had the kind of confidence that comes not from doing hard things, but from never having been told he couldn't. He didn't like me from the first week. I don't think it was personal exactly. I think it was structural. I was older than him, lower in commissioned rank, but senior in operational experience, and I kept quietly correcting his flight coordination errors before they became disasters. That's a particular kind of threat to a certain kind of man. Not a threat he can fight, a threat he has to swallow. He started small, leaving me off distribution lists for briefings, referring to me as the sergeant in meetings where everyone else was called by name. Once, in front of 4 other officers, he said my insertion route recommendation was overly cautious and then submitted a nearly identical version 40 minutes later under his own name. I documented everything: dates, times, witnesses. Sergeant Walsh saw it too and started keeping her own notes without me asking her to. I had learned early that in spaces like this, evidence is your only real currency. The mission we called Crosswind was the one that changed everything, though I didn't know it while it was happening. At the time, it just felt like the worst night of my life. We were running a 3-helicopter insertion into a valley that intelligence had flagged as low risk. My team had spent 2 weeks building the flight plan. I had flagged in writing twice that the intel on the eastern ridgeline felt thin. Not wrong, just thin. Not enough sources, not enough cross-referencing. I put it in my report on a Tuesday and again on the Thursday before the mission. Bryce overrode both flags. He had Hartley's sign-off. The mission was a go. The second helicopter took fire from the eastern ridgeline. My helicopter Ghost 6, which I was piloting, took secondary fire while we were pulling the first bird out of the kill zone. I got hit in the left shoulder, kept flying, got all 3 aircraft back to base. 4 soldiers wounded. No fatalities. When we landed, Bryce was waiting on the tarmac. He looked at me and I could see him calculating something. He wrote the after-action report. In it, my permission flags weren't mentioned. The eastern ridgeline intel concern wasn't mentioned. What was mentioned, twice, was that my bird had taken fire while deviating from the approved flight path. I had not deviated. I have the flight data to prove it, which I pulled from the black box that same night while my shoulder was just being stitched up, because I knew before I even read his report that this was coming. When I went to Captain Donovan, he looked at the data and then looked at me and said, "Merritt, I believe you, but Hartley's already signed off on Calloway's version." I said, "Then we take it up the chain." He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know what that costs?" I said yes. I did know. I had watched it happen to others. The quiet rerouting of assignments. The performance reviews that were technically positive but somehow always found something. The way a woman who makes noise disappears from the promotion list without anyone ever saying it out loud. I said yes anyway. My name went to the Inspector General's office on a Friday. By Monday morning, I could feel the temperature in every room I walked into drop by about 10 degrees. Sergeant Walsh didn't care. She sat down next to me at lunch like nothing had happened, and when I looked at her, she said, "I submitted a corroborating statement this morning." Like it was nothing, like she hadn't just put herself in exactly the same crosshairs. I said, "Walsh, you didn't have to." She said, "I know what I saw. Pass the salt. I will never forget that. The salt. The ordinary kitchen table matter-of-factness of it. Like truth-telling was just one of the things you did between tasks." Stitch submitted a statement too, 3 days later. He didn't mention it to me directly. I found out from a memo. That's just how he was. The investigation took 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which I continued doing my job, and Bryce continued doing his, and Colonel Hartley continued treating me like a minor inconvenience who had made the grave error of persisting. There was a night, around week 4, when I sat in my bunk in the dark and genuinely asked myself if it was worth it, not in a dramatic way, in a very quiet, very tired way. I had done everything right. I had the data. I had witnesses. I had documentation going back 9 months. And I still could not shake the feeling that the system I was trusting to be fair was the same system that had built Colonel Hartley, that had shaped Bryce Calloway, that had looked at me across a briefing room 2 years earlier and said the word, honey. I called my dad that night. It was 3 a.m., my time, which made it 2 p.m. in Clarksville, and he picked up on the second ring because he always did. I didn't tell him all of it. I told him enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, your grandfather used to say that the army would test your character exactly as many times as it takes to find out if you have any. I said, what does that mean? He said, it means you're not done yet. The investigation findings came back on a Tuesday in March. The IG found that Lieutenant Calloway's after-action report contained materially inaccurate information regarding the deviation from the flight path. The Eastern Ridgeline intel flags I had submitted were entered into the record. Bryce was formally censured. Colonel Hartley was not censured. He was counseled, which is the Army's way of saying something happened but not too loudly. But here's the thing, and this is the thing I couldn't have predicted. The findings were briefed up, all the way up, to a brigadier general named Whitmore, who had apparently been watching the task force for reasons that had nothing to do with me. 3 weeks after the IG findings, I was called to a meeting I hadn't been told the subject of. I walked in expecting Donovan. I found General Whitmore. He was a small man, which I hadn't expected. Compact, quiet-voiced, with the kind of stillness that means a person has nothing left to prove. He looked at my file for a moment before he looked at me. Then he said, I've been doing this for 26 years, Sergeant Merritt. In that time, I've seen a lot of people submit documentation. I've seen very few people submit it knowing what it costs and do it anyway. I didn't know what to say, so I said, yes, sir. He said, Ghost 6. He said it differently than Hartley had said it. Do you know why that call sign? I said, because on the 160th, your call sign is what you carry. It's not a nickname. It's your record. Every mission you've flown, every one you brought home. Ghost 6 was the call sign of the first female Night Stalker crew chief I ever knew. She didn't come home from her 3rd deployment. I flew under her. I took the name to carry it forward. There was a silence that felt like something opening up in the room. He said, I'm recommending you for the Joint Special Operations Aviation Command position in Bagram. That's a major's billet. I said, sir? He said, you're going to have to pass the written evaluation and the review board. But I want you in that biplane. The Army needs what you have, which is apparently a working conscience and an inability to falsify records under pressure. A pause. That last part was a compliment. I didn't see Bryce Calloway again for almost 2 years. When I did, it was at a conference in Washington, D.C., a joint services leadership summit that I had been invited to present at as part of a panel on night operations protocol and intel validation frameworks, which, if you want the full picture, is directly descended from the documentation I had been flagging since that Tuesday in Afghanistan. The protocol I had first recommended, the one Bryce overrode, was now part of the standard evaluation checklist for special operations flight missions across 3 commands. I didn't go looking for him at the conference. I was in the lobby of the hotel with a cup of coffee, going over my presentation notes when I heard my name. Not Merritt, not even Sergeant or Major. Just my name. I looked up and there he was. He had aged in ways that looked like the kind of years that cost something. He was wearing civilian clothes, which told me a lot before he said anything. He said, I heard about the JSHCO position and the protocol. I waited. He said, I want you to know that He started again. I knew the flag was valid, the Eastern Ridgeline. I knew it when I overrode it. I had suspected that. But hearing it out loud still landed somewhere. He said, I thought Hartley would back me up no matter what, and I thought you'd. He paused. I thought you'd take the L and move on. I said, why would I do that? He didn't have a real answer. I said, 4 soldiers got wounded on that mission. 2 of them still have hardware in their legs. That's not an L I was willing to take. He said he was sorry. Maybe he meant it. I'm honestly not sure it matters. Not anymore. Bryce left the army 8 months after the IG findings. Chose not to re-enlist. I have heard he works in private logistics now, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I don't think about him much. What I do think about still is that night in the bunk at week 4 of the investigation. That quiet question I asked myself in the dark. I think about it because I don't forget how close it was, how tired I was, how reasonable it would have felt in that moment to decide that the truth was too expensive. I want to remember that feeling because I think it's important, not as something shameful, but as something honest, as evidence that the decision wasn't easy, that it cost something, that I chose anyway. I was promoted to Major 11 months after the meeting with General Whitmore. The ceremony was small. My parents came down from Clarksville. My dad wore the same blazer he'd worn to my basic graduation and my flight school pinning, which by my count was its third military ceremony. My mother cried, which she would deny if you asked her directly. Sergeant Walsh made the drive from Fort Bragg. She had made E7 by then, and she walked into the room like she owned it, which she basically did. We didn't make a big thing of it. We just looked at each other and that was enough. General Whitmore attended. He didn't have to. He pinned my rank himself, which he also didn't have to do, and when he did, he said quietly enough that only I could hear, Ghost 6. Not as a joke, not as a question, as a name, as a record, as every mission I had flown, and everyone I had brought home, and the one woman I had never met whose call sign I had carried forward into places she never got to go. I said, "Yes, sir." Colonel Hartley was not there. He had retired 4 months earlier, in a ceremony I was not invited to and did not attend. I have heard he lives in South Carolina now. I think about him sometimes when I'm in a briefing room. Not with anger, not anymore, but with something I don't quite have a word for. Something like understanding without excusing. He was a product of a system that told him for 30 years that certain people in certain rooms were not to be taken seriously. He believed it. And then one day, a sergeant with a call sign and 2,000 flight hours and a very organized paper trail asked him quietly and permanently to reconsider. I don't know if he ever did. That's not mine to carry. What's mine is this: the protocol in the checklist. The soldiers in that valley who came home, Walsh, who passed the salt. My dad on the phone at 3 a.m. saying you're not done yet. What's mine is Ghost 6 and everything it means to carry a name forward. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to hold your ground when the ground keeps shifting underneath you. Not in some abstract, motivational sense. I mean the specific, physical experience of sitting in a bunk at 2 a.m. in week 4 of an investigation, shoulder still sore from the stitches, knowing that the person who falsified your record is sleeping fine 2 buildings over, because he's always slept fine, because nothing has ever cost him the way things have cost you. I mean that feeling. The particular exhaustion of being right and still not knowing if it matters. What I learned, not from a book, not from a speech, from that actual experience, is that integrity is not a feeling. It is a practice. And like any practice, it is hardest precisely at the moment you most need it. Bryce knew the Eastern Ridgeline flag was valid. He told me so himself, 2 years later in a hotel lobby in Washington. He overrode it anyway because he calculated that the system would protect him and I would absorb the consequence. That calculation was rational, based on everything he had seen. He had watched the system work exactly that way, for people to look like him, for years. What he didn't calculate was Walsh. He didn't calculate Stitch, quietly submitting a corroborating statement without telling me. He didn't calculate that the data from a flight recorder doesn't negotiate, doesn't get tired, doesn't decide the cost is too high. He built his version of events on the assumption that I was alone, and I wasn't. That's the thing about doing your work honestly, over time. You build something. Not a reputation, exactly, something quieter than that. A record of who you actually are, made up of small decisions, most of which nobody noticed at the time. The documentation I kept for 9 months before Crosswind, the flags I submitted twice in writing, the black box data I pulled while my shoulder was being stitched. None of it felt significant in the moment. It felt like paperwork. It felt like stubbornness. It felt, some nights, like I was the only person who thought it mattered. But that's how it works. Causes produce effects. Not on a schedule you get to choose, not in a form you necessarily expect, but they do. Bryce's decision to falsify that report didn't disappear because Hartley signed off on it. It waited. My documentation didn't disappear because nobody thanked me for it. It waited too. General Whitmore didn't promote me because he felt sorry for me. He promoted me because when he looked at the record, the actual documented flight data verified record, what he saw was someone who had been tested and had not flinched. That's all integrity ever is. Not flinching when it would be easier and more comfortable and significantly less professionally dangerous to do so. I'm not going to tell you it's easy. Walsh made it look easy, passing this all like nothing had happened. But I watched her face when she thought no one was looking, and I know it wasn't. My dad made it look simple on the phone at 3 a.m. But I know what he didn't say. But it costs a parent to watch their kid go through something hard and choose not to rescue them from it, because some things you have to carry yourself. The hardest part isn't the moment of decision. The hardest part is the long middle, the 6 weeks when nothing is resolved, when you have to keep showing up and doing your job and trusting that what you did was enough. Most people break there, not at the crisis point, but in the waiting. They revise their memory of what happened. They decide maybe they were wrong. They find a reason to let it go. I almost did. I want to be honest about that. The decision to keep going wasn't automatic. It cost something every single day. What got me through was not confidence that I would win. It was something simpler and harder. I knew what happened. I had been there. I had the data. And I was not willing to be the person who looked away from what she knew was true because the truth was inconvenient. Ghost 6 is a name I carry because someone carried it before me. Someone who didn't come home. Someone whose record I didn't want to waste. I think about that when things get hard. Not as a burden, but as a reason. You don't get to choose what you inherit. You do get to choose what you inherit. You do get to choose what you do with it.